Do low-carb diets cause atrial fibrillation? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to another Dr. Westman Reacts. I was sent a video, and thanks for sending videos for me to react to, by Dave RX, talking about a study about low-carb diets and atrial fibrillation. He goes into great detail about dissecting the article, and let's see what he has to say.
Atrial fibrillation and low-carb diet. Does a low-carb diet increase or decrease the risk of developing atrial fibrillation? This is a very relevant topic today because keto is a big thing. Keto diet only has 5% of calories coming from carbohydrates. So this paper may shine a light on whether or not that's good or bad for AFib. So we look at this paper, 13,385 people, average age 54 years old, average follow-up over 22 years. So a lot of people, long period of time, that's generally a good thing. But the problem with this study is that they documented food intake in these people by questionnaire, and they only administered the questionnaire 2 times over a 20-plus year period.
So, I mean, that's unfortunately not good enough, right? If you were in a court of law, for example, and you said twice over the last couple of years, here's what I ate, is that really good enough to prove what you ate? So a lot of these epidemiology studies, even if they're prospective, meaning going forward in time, they're going to be fraught with the problem of, do we really know what people are eating? And he's right to pull that out as a major flaw. In fact, I probably wouldn't go beyond this.
So that's an acknowledged weakness of the study. But during the follow-up period, 13.5% of participants developed atrial fibrillation. Now, who developed AFib? Was it the people who ate a lot of carbs or the people who didn't eat a lot of carbs? So this is a bunch of the data from the study, but I'm going to pluck out just the food stuff, most of the food stuff to look at. So let's condense it down. So keep in mind 13,385 people. They divided that whole group into 4 quarters, so 25% in each subgroup here. So the first one, quartile 1, those are the 25% of people with the lowest carbohydrate intake. And then quartile 4 over here on the other end of the spectrum represents the people with the highest carbohydrate intake. I put a red box around the data from the people with the highest carb intake because I want to compare that data to the people with the lowest carb intake and look at the differences. So the things that jump out are the people with low carb intake have a lot more calories coming from animal protein and animal fat. Whereas in the high carb group, these people are getting relatively lower calories from animal protein and animal fat.
And remember, this is twice over decades that they were asked. But also, did you pick up that quartile 1 was 37% carbohydrate? So that's very high. It's not keto by any means. He's going to pick that up in just a minute.
And then also, if you look at the plant protein, the high carb group is getting more plant protein, more fiber, which comes from plants, whereas the low carb group getting less fiber, less plant protein. So overall, what we see here, low carb means high meat, low plant, and high carb, apparently, relatively speaking, means high plant, low meat consumption. Okay, so here's the information we all came to the party to see. So the people in quartile 4, this is the people with the highest carbohydrate intake, had a hazard ratio of 0.64. That means their risk of developing AFib compared to the group with the lowest carbohydrate intake was 36% lower. That's a good thing. So the people with the highest carbohydrate intake had the lowest risk of AFib. That's kind of a big deal. And that's surprising, right? Because people who are doing low-carb diet, generally they're doing that for the health benefits, right? They want to lose a lot of weight. They want to lose it, in a reasonable amount of time. They don't want to wait 20 years to lose the weight. They want it to happen in a matter of months. So they adopt this low-carb diet, and it seems to work. But over the long term, what this information is telling us is that a low-carb diet may increase the risk of AFib.
As defined by under like 35% carbs. That's not keto. So we're going to see, can you extrapolate? Now, again, they're measuring this twice over several decades. Let's just assume this is really what they're eating. That fatal flaw to me aside, that the idea of 35% carbohydrate being sufficient to say something about a keto diet, we're going to get into that. Is that really good enough?
So they proposed a couple mechanistic explanations for this. They said the low-carb diet may lead to lower intake of anti-inflammatory fruits, vegetables, and grains, and the association between a pro-inflammatory state and AFib has been demonstrated extensively. So you want those anti-inflammatory foods in your diet because it seems that maybe that reduces inflammation in the body and leads to a lower AFib risk. That's one theory. Another theory is that fat and protein consumption may stimulate oxidative stress. So fat and protein predominantly come from meat. So they're saying the consequent oxidative stress may increase the risk of AFib. So the conclusion, this is the last sentence from the paper, a low-carbohydrate diet, a way to control weight, should be cautiously recommended, especially considering the potential influence on arrhythmia. So they're basically saying what I said. People are usually doing the low-carb diet to lose weight or to control weight, but the long-term effects on arrhythmia risk may outweigh the benefit.
So in our paper, 2007, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, we came up with some guidelines or categories for low-carb diets. And this was basically a low-carb diet under 35%. Very low carbohydrates being under 10, and then keto under 5%, somewhere in there. So much less than the 60% carbohydrates that the comparison group or the typical American or Chinese patient or participant in this study. So again, the fatal flaw being, do we really know what they ate? And what is the absolute risk we want to know? Well, remember, it was 13% for everyone, and there was a 60% reduction. I don't know if we're going to actually get into the relative risk versus absolute risk. Let's keep going.
So people have some criticisms about this paper. One is obvious. I pointed it out at the beginning. It has to do with the questionnaire. And they acknowledge that that's a problem. They say our study was based on the diet information at baseline, which means at the beginning of the study. In other words, the questionnaire that they administered at the beginning of the study. And dietary patterns could change during over 20 years of follow-up. Well, no kidding. Yeah, people are going to change over a 20-year period of time, that's for sure. And that includes the foods that they're eating. So yeah, that's a valid criticism. Criticism number 2, this is one that I hear from people who are tearing this paper apart online. They just don't like what it says because they're low-carb diet evangelists, right? So they don't like what it says. But so this,
well, or are we scientists? Wait a second.
This is what they're basically saying. And I think it's a consequence of the fact that the keto diet is so popular right now. So they're saying if you're doing a real low-carb diet like the keto diet, you're only getting 5% of calories from carbohydrates. But in this study, the quote-unquote low-carb group still consumed an average of 37.2% of calories on average from carbohydrates. And they're saying that that says nothing about the keto diet. It doesn't show us that the keto diet is necessarily bad for AFib.
Maybe I was one of those people, in fact I was, saying it doesn't really tell us about a keto diet because there are threshold effects actually. When you go into ketosis, a lot of things change. It's actually anti-inflammatory, kind of putting a kink into a wrinkle into that first hypothesis that you're not getting anti-inflammatory carbs. On a low-carb diet, you're actually limiting the pro-inflammatory carbs. So yeah, I have a problem. It doesn't really say anything about keto diet, but it does say something about a 35% kind of diet.
And I'll say, yeah, that's a valid criticism. But if you look in the paper, you'll get a more robust display of the data. So on the right-hand side, this is the hazard ratio. You want to be below 1, right? Where if 1 is like the reference point. So people who are eating more carbohydrates, in this case more than 50% of carbohydrates, they're getting below 1. So, that's a good thing. Lower risk of AFib. people who are to the left, who are eating less carbohydrates, their hazard ratio is going above 1. That means there's a higher risk.
So this is very interesting. If you look here, this is the actual data from what people self-report a couple times over several decades. And you can see that the lowest amount of carbs that someone actually ever said looks like about 7%. You have to wonder, if you're doing a data analysis, you might even throw out someone at a keto level of carbs. You might say that's not possible, it's an error. Well, when you look at this, there might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 people below 20% carbs. And even then, the amount of people eating, the amount of carbs eaten goes way up. This reminds me of the graph where I sat in an hour or two long presentation by a researcher, presenter named Edward Tufte. Do you remember Tufte had these books, and you go to a seminar, you go through the books, and there was a graph almost like this where it was the temperature on the morning of the launch of the Challenger space shuttle. And that morning, the temperature was so low that there was no data. So they had data on the flight of the space shuttles on lots of different days, lots of different mornings. But that morning was off the chart. Like this, the people we're talking about, they're not even represented on this chart. And so what happened in the evaluation or the presentation that Professor Tufte gave, and I assume that it was accurate, is that they went back and forth with the company, and should we launch, should we not? The argument was, well, kind of like this line, that even though the temperatures have gone down, the flight launches have been fine, that there was no data to populate that area of the temperature of that morning. What happened was the Challenger shuttle launched, disaster. The look into what happened is that these O-rings, the plastic, hardened such that they didn't make a seal anymore. And in a classic governmental hearing, one of the prominent scientists at the time just had to put the O-ring material in water at that temperature of that morning and show that the material broke, and it lost its pliability. Of course, you didn't have that ability in real time, and there are so many different things. How would you know it was just that one O-ring? So what I learned from that is when you don't have data, you don't have data. In fact, I went back to a book called How to Lie with Statistics. It's a classic little red book. And in there, Mark Twain said, watch out for those who generalize, because, they said that the Mississippi River is growing at a certain rate in length, and so eventually it's going to go down to South America, And so if you over extrapolate, I think it was Mark Twain who also said that I quit smoking 1,000,000 times and then I started the next day. So here we don't have any data about keto diets, and so you can't say anything. But let's see what Dave RX says.
Of a fib compared to the reference point. So what people are saying is, okay, keto, 5% of calories are coming from carbohydrates. That would put you at right about here, 5%. There's like nobody representing that group right on this graph. So they're saying, okay, throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's nobody representing the 5% carbohydrate intake people, so it's meaningless. Well, I don't think that's really wise to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Look at the trend line. It's very clearly going up, like the fewer carbs that you're eating, which means you're going to be eating more protein and fat. So in other words, you could say the more protein and fat that you're eating, the higher your risk of atrial fibrillation.
I'm almost getting chills thinking about the argument about the morning of the launch. Apparently the company said we don't know, but the governmental forces said we need to launch. And look, the extrapolation line but there's no data. The temperature is lower than we've ever had. And so I wouldn't want this doctor to be advising on a policy level because there is no data. You can't extrapolate in this kind of situation when lives are at stake.
And there's no indication to me, no reason to believe that this trend is going to reverse if you were to be able to get a big group representing 5% carbohydrate intake. I just don't reasonably...
Yes, and there is. And so he doesn't know. That's okay. So actually, ketosis is a situation where you're getting great fuel to nervous tissue. And atrial fibrillation is a problem of actually the conduction system of the heart. The heart has a conduction system, it has a pump system, it has the artery system. And so it's really three major, well, and then it also is a hormonal organ as well. So when someone says it's good for the heart, they usually mean the coronary arteries. But here, the conduction system on the heart actually being more of a nerve tissue, may actually do better with ketones. And because the brain actually, you can reverse seizures with a keto diet in susceptible children, for example. Yes, what you eat and ketosis can actually affect the brain. There are 2 new mental health units, one at Harvard, one at Stanford, that are using keto diets for major medical health conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. That's under research now. So I disagree. There is a rationale why there would be a threshold effect and that line would not actually keep going up.
I see this trend reversing. I don't see this line just abruptly turning down and going, yeah, there's this big benefit. No, I doubt it. I highly doubt it. If anything, it's going to go up, up, up. There could be a slight reversal. You never know. I'm not going to over speculate, but the trend line is, pretty clearly going up, up, up for less and less carb intake. So one thing to keep in mind, they didn't talk about this in the paper, but it's very obvious, so I have to point it out. Two of the things that you see pop up again and again with atrial fibrillation, things that increase the risk of AFib are sugar and inflammation. So you don't want sugar, like simple sugar. We're talking like candy, also like simple carbohydrates like white bread, for instance. Those things spike blood sugar and promote inflammation. And sugar and inflammation are clearly associated with AFib. So when we say you want to have perhaps more carbohydrates in your diet, you have to be really, really aware of like what kind of carbohydrates. You don't just want to start replacing, for instance, replacing meat with white bread and sugar. Like that's not going to help you.
Now that I'm looking at this bell-shaped curve in more detail, I would really like to know if those people under the 20%, if any of them had atrial fibrillation, if there was actually a signal. I guess you could have done a what's called a restricted cubic spline analysis on here to see if there would tug down the line there. But you have individual data there, and to know whether now you could analyze this, not just the quartiles, but you could do it, say, in deciles and see what the risk of atrial fibrillation is. That might drill down, but still, there's nobody doing a keto diet. How can you comment on a keto diet?
Because of the association between sugar and inflammation and atrial fibrillation. So you're going to be looking at your whole food plant-based things like fruits and vegetables and grains, for example. All right, so that's all for today.
Oh, no, and then he ends up with plant-based. Well, I'm not persuaded by this study. My tolerance of this research ends with the fatal flaw of you really don't know what people were eating. And it's amazing that these things get studied and then published. There's an echo chamber of people who sit back and think this is legitimate science and can tell us, inform us on what to do. I'm a clinical trialist, I'm human-centric, and if it has nothing to do with the keto diet, you can't comment on the keto diet. I hope you find that helpful. If you like it, please like, subscribe so you don't miss out on further videos. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto right, please look in the description below.